Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 19754 in the name of Pam Duncan Clancy on education. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Pam Duncan Clancy to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'd just like to apologise to the Chamber, in particular to Bob Doris and Jamie Hepburn, for getting the two confused in my closing remarks. Presiding Officer, I am pleased to bring this debate to the Chamber, which is motivated by my deep concern at the deteriorating learning and working environment in schools in Scotland. Education is a great leveller when we get it right. It can open horizons, build skills and deliver opportunity. For many, it can be a route out of poverty and into good and fair work. Education changed my life, and it is incumbent on all of us here to ensure we build and deliver an education system that gives every young person in Scotland the tools they need to get everything they want out of life. Presiding Officer, Scotland's education system was once the envy of the world. But after nearly 2 decades of the SNP government, sadly this is no longer the case. It's not just me who worries about this. Satisfaction with our schools, especially among those who experience it firsthand, is at an all-time low. When we look at the environment in schools, we can perhaps see why. In the last 18 months, trade unions report that 44% of teaching staff say they'd experienced physical abuse or violence from pupils, and 90% have experienced verbal abuse. They've been sworn at, hit or punched, kicked, spat at, headbutted, and one teacher even had a firework thrown in their direction. Most worryingly, Presiding Officer, was the growing evidence that female staff suffered more frequent violence and abuse than their male colleagues, with nearly half of female teachers in Scotland saying they'd experienced physical abuse or violence from pupils, compared to 36% of males. A report from School Leaders Scotland, published in the summer, found that school leaders had significant concerns about this rise in aggressive and abusive behaviour. One commented that the abusive and aggressive behaviour of a small but difficult core of young people and the lack of available sanctions to use or support from the authority makes the job seem not worthwhile at times. At a GMB roundtable, and I refer members to my register of interest, pupil support staff told me that violence in schools had become expected and seen as part of the job. One pupil support assistant shared that she even has an alarm she charges every day and wears around her neck in case she's attacked. Trade unions and others, including people in this chamber, have long been calling for the government to tackle the rising issue of violent and abusive behaviour. And, Presiding Officer, workload is making things worse. Overworked staff and under-resourced pupil support has left classrooms like pressure cookers. 45% of respondents to an Association of Head Teachers and Deputies survey said if they could change one thing, it would be the support for pupils with additional support needs and distressed pupils. Presiding Officer, this is what I hear everywhere I go, including from parents who talk passionately about their worries on CAMHS waiting times, rendering help a pipe dream, a lack of speech and language therapists, and no pathway for neurodivergent young people to get support they desperately need. These are just some examples of the sorts of systemic issues that must be addressed if the government's late advice on consequences and risk are to be truly helpful. The EIS is balloting its members because this has gone on too long. The SNP government promised action on non-contact time in its manifesto. With 6 months until the next election, it looks fast to become another broken promise. The government has also sat on, not acted on, a report now 10 years old that sets out ways to address workload pressures. Yet we have teachers reporting working at least a day a week above their contracted hours. The government has broken their promise on 3,500 more teachers, and 15, 16 and 17-year-olds across the country are denied chances to study some subjects as a result. It's not only that evidence and report that the government has ignored. Hayward, Morgan, screeds of advice from experts like Enlighten on the need for knowledge in the curriculum and others on the importance of teaching synthetic phonics all sit on the Cabinet Secretary's shelf. Presiding Officer, we have some of the most dedicated teachers and school staff, the most determined pupils and the strongest and most ambitious parents in the world. But the failure of this SNP government to listen to experts, act on advice and act fast, prioritise young people, has left the attainment gap stubbornly wide, teachers struggling with unmanageable workloads, parents at the end of their tether, and ultimately sees nearly 250,000 young people not in employment. Their incompetence and distraction, I'm afraid, have allowed schools to deteriorate and young people denied the opportunities they deserve. Scotland's young people have enormous potential. Our job together is to make sure that every child leaves education confident, resilient and equipped with the knowledge and skills to thrive in work and in life. And so I'd ask the Government to reflect, change course, use this moment and reset. Focus on retraining, supporting and working with staff. Gather data on which teachers are needed, where and when. Make PEF permanent and give security in planning and addressing staff workload urgently. Take action to make reporting and recording poor behaviour mandatory and consistent to help improve the working environment and retain staff. Rebuild the scaffolding around young people so they get the support they need from cradle all the way to career, so that they can get the best out of education and spread opportunity at every age and every stage. Make classes phone-free and learning the priority. Reform initial teacher education so that it meets the needs of the moment and align places to a comprehensive workforce plan. A workforce plan this Parliament voted for over a year and a half ago that we are yet to see from this Government. Create a national register of supply teachers so that teachers can move to where they're needed and get jobs when they want them. Use technology and digitisation to reduce workload. Presiding Officer, there are many great ideas, not just proffered from these benches, but from reports, screeds of reports and experts across Scotland, from parents, from pupils, from teachers and from staff in the system. The Government must listen to them. While things have deteriorated on this Government's watch, though, this is not as good as it gets. We can have a system that delivers high and rising standards, the right support at the right time for every child and every staff member, and that unlocks opportunity for all. That's the future, that's what's at stake, and that's what Scotland can have if it changes direction. After nearly 2 decades, it's clear this Government can't or won't do this, but a Scottish Labour Government will if we're elected in May. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Duncan Clancy. And could I ask you please to move the motion?
I move the motion in my name.
Many thanks. I now call on Jenny Garuth, Cabinet Secretary, to speak to and move Amendment 19754.2. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, doom and gloom have haunted the Scotland national men's football team since we last qualified for the World Cup in 1998. But last night, they gave us all a reason to believe again, a nation gripped with the possibility of what might be. Daring to dream, the Scotland men's team have given the country more than a bit of hope today. I am afraid, however, that there is no such hope invested in the Labour Party's motion this afternoon. In fact, the motion may as well have quoted the words of the brilliant John McGinn, who, on leaving the pitch last night, declared, "I thought we were pretty rubbish, to be honest." There are no ideas in Labour's motion on how to improve our schools, and while I accept there are challenges, I do not recognise the bleak picture of Scotland's schools being painted before us today. Presiding Officer, there is a huge amount to celebrate. Happy to give way to the member.
I appreciate the member, the Cabinet Secretary, taking my intervention. Did the Cabinet Secretary not hear the final, at least a minute and a half of my speech, where I outlined exactly what the Cabinet Secretary and the Scottish Government could do to inject hope and opportunity into the education system in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there's nothing positive in the motion before us today. I direct the member to her motion. It mentions nothing positive in Scotland's education system. But there is a huge amount to be positive about in our education system. And yesterday, I attended the Learning Places Scotland conference at the SECC. And it might interest Labour MSPs to know that officials from the UK Government's Department for Education were present. They wanted to learn more about how this Government has transformed the learning environments in Scotland's schools. I remind the Chamber that, of course, thanks to direct investment from this Government, the proportion of schools in Scotland in good or satisfactory condition has improved from roughly 62% in 2007, when Labour were last in power in Scotland, to today over 92%. The learning environment in Scotland's schools, derided by today's motion, has been transformed under this SNP Scottish Government. And even if Scottish Labour's motion today can't appear to accept that, I very much welcome that civil servants working for Labour ministers in London can. I give way again to the member.
I appreciate the Cabinet Secretary for being so generous and giving away again. Can the Cabinet Secretary reflect on the fact that the school condition survey hasn't been carried out for hundreds of schools across the country for over 5 years, and so the data that the Cabinet Secretary is referring to hasn't been updated.
Cabinet Secretary.
No, I do not accept the point the member has made. She has asked me a number of written questions on this. Some of them pertain to PFI schools, which of course were a feature of Labour's time in office. And it means, of course, today that this government is having to repay millions of pounds of taxpayers' money to those school buildings, which means I have less in my education budget because of actions taken by Ms Duncan Glancy's colleagues in a former parliament. But there is lots to be positive about in Scottish education, presiding officer. So let's look at some of the positives. I was really pleased last week to secure agreement from the teaching unions to a 7.5% pay increase over 2 years. That pay deal means that Scotland's teachers remain the best paid on these islands, and it also ensures that our teachers get that pay increase in time for Christmas, which I know is really welcome news. The agreement means that our classroom teachers will now earn up to £54,000 a year, and the rung below deputy heads will earn up to £74,205 a year from August, roughly £300 less than an MSP salary. Securing that 2-year pay deal, though, has been really important in providing the impetus for securing progress on reducing class contact, as we have heard today. Greater standardisation in education is also going to provide for more consistency for pupils, and in terms of workload, we know there is a need to standardise what is being asked of our teachers. Data should be about driving improvement and supporting quality learning and teaching. It's not fair that reporting requirements, for example, differ by local authority. Expectations of our staff should be consistent. The Government will therefore begin discussions with COSLA on the standardisation of data collection to support reducing teacher workload. This work is also being supplemented by 2 CIFTech challenges, a challenge launched back in summer 2024, building a tool which seeks to use AI to streamline admin and planning in relation to ASN. We also announced a further challenge this summer, which is again about identifying opportunities to use AI to support a reduction in teacher workload. And of course, teacher workload can't be reduced without the role of pupil support assistants, and I can confirm today my support for a national model of accreditation for pupil support assistants, and I'll be taking that forward with COSLA as a matter of priority. Presiding officer, I note that today's motion also makes no mention of poverty, and I think we should be mindful that the NESUT's survey of teachers last month told of their views on austerity, with teachers saying that the 2-child cap means that kids from larger families are not able to be supported. I very much hope that Labour members will be pressing those points on their colleagues in London to ensure that the 2-child cap is fully lifted across the United Kingdom to lift these children and young people out of poverty so that they can attain their educational potential. This year's education and skills budget, of course, also provides a record £4.3 billion for Scottish education. It is imperative, therefore, that this funding, protected at national level, gets into Scotland's classrooms where it is needed. That's why I have appointed former head teacher Don Wilson to provide the Government with an independent report on reforming school governance and funding. It is essential that funding makes its way into our classrooms where I know it is needed most. I look forward, presiding officer, to the remainder of today's debate and listening again to the positives from Scotland's education system.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Could I ask you please to move the amendment?
I move the motion in my name.
The amendment, thank you. I now call on Miles Briggs to speak to and move Amendment 1975 4.1. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I start on a positive note by thanking the Labour Party for bringing forward an education debate, because I think it is important that we have these. In January, Scottish Conservatives brought forward a very similar debate around our school environment. And I think I would return to this every single week, because that's what parents, pupils and teachers are telling us. The problems which are still happening in our schools must be addressed. And I don't see that as a negative thing. I see it as what people are looking to this Parliament to do something about. And in March of this year, we secured a debate around ending violence in our schools as well. And I think the Cabinet Secretary, and she can maybe, if she's closing this debate, touch upon some of this. But I think we have seen a movement from the Scottish Government over the last year to recognise that we do have a problem in our classrooms, that teachers and violence in our classrooms is something which we cannot just hope is not happening, because the number of teachers has decreased by almost 1,700 over the time this government's been in power. I think that is because of the school environment as well. The number of post-probation teachers finding full-time employment has decreased. And there's been a huge increase in the number of days which has lost from teachers having poor mental health in our school workplaces. More than 30% of pupils are missing more than 10% of their school learning. And Scotland's classrooms are now the most violent in the UK. Between March 2014 and 2024, there were 490 reports of serious injuries to school staff in Scotland caused by violence. When adjusted for population, that rate is higher than in England and Wales. So we have a problem, and we need to make sure that we're not just burying our head in the sand, but looking to solutions. And I think that's where the Cabinet Secretary, I hope, will listen to those of us who are raising these issues. Now, I welcome the fact that when we brought forward these debates, we asked for a clear national policy around consequences. And the Cabinet Secretary said we would see that within the guidance. We need to see a situation where pupils have to take responsibility for their actions, that any violence in our schools is not tolerated, and that exclusion will be a last resort, which teachers know that this Parliament and this Cabinet Secretary will support them if needed to take forward. And ministers have acknowledged that this rise in violence and abuse in our schools has to be addressed. Now, on Friday, I, along with the Cabinet Secretary, attended the School Leaders Conference, School Leaders Scotland Conference. And one aspect of speaking to teachers which really struck me, and something I wanted to include in this, was some of the conversations we had around where technology, bullying as well, are really at the heart of some of their concerns. And something I think that, although we have heard the First Minister say there is work ongoing, they want to see leadership from the government on what they should be doing. A ban on social media was something we... Yes, more than happy
Martin
to.
Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Miles Briggs for taking the intervention, and indeed at that very conference did he not take away the same message that I did, which he's already hinted at, that without absolute 100% support from the Scottish Government, from the Scottish Parliament and from Scotland, school leaders are not going to be able to enforce this.
Miles Briggs.
I did, absolutely, and that's why I wanted to touch upon this, because I think it's something which our school leaders are asking for support on, and we need to make sure there's an opportunity for this Parliament, but for the government to very much hear that message, because if we don't, then that is the next crisis which we will be debating. I was actually shocked by some of the conversations about where young people are experiencing that bullying now, and it's something which I would hope the government would realise needs more debate. I know I'm running out of time, Deputy Presiding Officer, so to conclude, it is clear that violence is out of control in many of our classrooms and needs to be addressed. The SNP, Scottish Government, need to make sure that teachers have the 100% support to do that. Scottish Conservatives would work to bring back common sense in dealing with effectively disruptive pupils, empowering our teachers and rolling out, as has been suggested, a mobile phone ban in our classrooms, which is making such a positive difference. And I move the amendment in my name. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call on Lorna Slater to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am glad that the Labour Party have given us the opportunity to debate the situation in Scotland's schools this afternoon, although I am frankly depressed and disappointed by their motion. Teachers, support staff and their students all face huge challenges, and this motion was an opportunity to lay out potential solutions to those challenges. It doesn't do that. An opportunity wasted. The Scottish Greens recognise the challenges in our classrooms, and we have solutions to them, starting with teacher workload. Despite teaching being a very well-paid profession, we have huge recruitment and retention challenges in the secondary sector. And the most common reason cited by teachers considering leaving the profession is the crushing workload. Much of that workload doesn't even improve the quality of teaching and learning. It is bureaucratic and entirely unnecessary. A vast system of data collection has been established both by national and local government, with the burden falling on overworked classroom teachers. Take standardised tests as an example. The Scottish Greens oppose SNSAs entirely. We believe they are rooted in a mistrust of teachers, and the anxiety they generate simply isn't worth the limited data collected. The last session of this Parliament voted to scrap them in P1 entirely, but the Scottish Government ignored this and went on with them. They cost at least £5 million per year, which is hard to justify when education budgets are so squeezed. But even if you accept the premise of SNSAs, the mission creep around them has created significant extra workload for teachers. Schools and councils have added their own reporting requirements on top of the core system itself. Teachers spend more and more of their week generating reports to feed the system, rather than focusing on the quality of their own teaching and the needs of their pupils. SNSAs are just one example of this. Across the country, there is a huge variety in the data collection demands placed on teachers. This is one area where reform could be delivered quickly and actually save rather than cost money. Green MSP submitted a report to the Cabinet Secretary 2 years ago. It was based on focus groups with teachers and head teachers from across the country, and it laid out examples of unnecessary and inconsistent data collection. We would strongly urge the Scottish Government to use that report as the starting point of a discussion with COSLA about how to reduce and standardise data collection in our schools. Our report also highlighted how the RAG system creates an incentive for schools to focus on the amber students, where most of the measurable improvement gains are to be had, effectively acting as a disincentive to support those pupils who are struggling and who are flagged as red. A system which revolves around blunt metrics is one which no longer sees our young people as individuals. That is the opposite of what the Curriculum for Excellence was supposed to have delivered. We would also like to see the 2015 Tackling Bureaucracy report dusted down and actually implemented. Many of these issues aren't new. We did not need to reinvent the wheel to tackle them, but we do need to trust teachers. That level of trust requires safeguards, not more form filling and reporting, but giving teachers the time and space for proper peer review and support. There are huge strengths in our education system. We should not create a doom loop of political and media commentary. Raising the challenges and putting pressure on both levels of government to solve them is essential. That requires solutions. Our school staff and students deserve nothing less.
Thank you, Ms Slater. And I now call on Willie Rennie to open on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Teachers and staff do some really good things in schools. They achieve an awful lot with transforming young people's lives, and we should recognise that. Sometimes I think, however, the government are a kind of a hindrance rather than a help in that regard. We've got massive challenges in our schools with behaviour, the additional support needs and the absence, which are all interconnected. But also many teachers leaving the profession because they've just had enough. They are fed up with the regular attacks and also real challenges with coping with 40–50% of their classes, sometimes more, having additional support needs without the appropriate support to help them. And then, of course, the long-vaunted closing of the poverty-related attainment gap, which has basically not really changed since Nicola Sturgeon promised it about 10 years ago. And then the international performance, which triggered this whole serious debate, I think, about the performance of Scottish education. I think the government's lost its way. I think it spends most of its time repairing the damage that it caused in the first place. It rejects the own reviews that it commissioned itself, and it's failing to deliver on its own promises. Take teacher contact time. Big promise. In fact, it was promised to be 90 minutes a day, I think, in the last SNP manifesto. We know it was 90 minutes a week. But they've not delivered it. They're supposed to have delivered it by now. And teachers are furious. They are so furious, they're talking about going on strike at the start of next year. We should have delivered it by now, but the SNP have failed to do so and are typically blaming somebody else for failing to deliver their promise. And then the poverty-related attainment gap. It's not been mentioned by the Cabinet Secretary, but within a few months we are supposed to have closed the gap. But the reality is the gap has flatlined, particularly in secondary school, over the last few years when we're supposed to have made that progress. And it is worth reminding people, and I know it's boring, but the then First Minister said we would judge her on education, and now she's nowhere to be seen. And the Cabinet Secretary doesn't even talk about that promise anymore. The regional collaboratives, which was introduced by the now First Minister, scrapped by the now Education Secretary, but you'll notice that the Education Secretary continues to refer repeatedly on the fact that local authorities, 32 of them, run the Scottish education system, with a hint that she wants to centralise education. And if that's what she wants, she should come out and say it, rather than just hinting at it. If that's what our policy is, let's have that discussion. Because I don't think Scotland wants to get into another debate about structures, just like we've had in the debate about skills. I think we should focus on the challenges that we face rather than having diversionary debates about structures. And then additional support needs, which the Cabinet Secretary celebrates recruiting more additional support needs teachers. But it was this government that cut the number of teachers in the first place, so it's not something we should celebrate. And then finally, Hayward, commissioned by this government, spent months, years debating it, gathering the support of many people across the education world, and as soon as the Education Secretary got a hold of it, she effectively rejected it. So the government has no real vision. I don't really understand what the government is trying to achieve. I would love if the government would really focus on, say for instance, the parity of esteem between vocational and academic. That would make a transformational difference to many young people who just get lost at school because school doesn't really fit their needs. I would love to have a proper programme of consequences and boundaries, empowering teachers to be able to manage their classrooms. I would love to have best practice shared across the country about how we deal with additional support needs so that those young people can get the chances just like everyone else. But this government is just lost. It doesn't seem to know what it wants to do with education, and I just wish that that would change.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. We now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 4 minutes. I call Paul Sweeney to be followed by Bill Kidd. Mr Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I rise to raise issues around spatial planning in schools in particular. I think it's an area where Glasgow is facing significant challenges in the last decade. After many years of population decline prior to that, the city's population has increased by around 7%. And indeed, we are seeing a protected increase continuing on school rolls. So Glasgow has had a predicted secondary pupil school growth forecast of 18% over the next decade and a predicted primary school pupil roll growth of 4% in the next 2 years. And this has been particularly acute in neighbourhoods where there has been high new build development, such as at Rob Royston in the north of the city. I've been recently undertaking a significant amount of work in that community with the Community Council and parents, and there's a statistically significant amount of parents and young people who are planning to have children who have told me that they are simply unable to access school provision in the nearby area, both in terms of secondary and primary provision. The secondary school, the nearest non-denominational secondary school, is Smithycroft, which is right on the limit of the catchment area. And just to qualify for the catchment, the children are having to walk an hour through an unlit graveyard, which is quite an unsafe route, is not well provisioned at all. And that school itself is reaching capacity, and the city's proposed strategy for expansion of school capacity is not to build a new school, which is probably a fair enough conclusion given the logistical aspects of running a school and to duplicate the amount of overheads you would need in terms of resourcing and so on. But their solution is to simply construct modular accommodation. We've already seen this in a number of different schools across the city in recent years. And it simply isn't optimal. I'm afraid building glorified porta cabins to accommodate expanding school roles on a secondary level is simply not acceptable. And I'd be keen to hear the Cabinet Secretary's views on how the City of Glasgow in particular is managing school expansion. We know that there's 30 secondary schools in Glasgow, of which 29 are operated under a public-private partnership model. That will come to a conclusion in 2030. But even under the PPP scheme, there has been proper expansion, such as the Bellarmine extension to St Paul's on the south side, which was opened in 2023. So I'd like to see the Cabinet Secretary engage more directly with Glasgow City Council to understand their estates management programme and really challenge this conclusion that simply modular buildings are the solution here. I know that it's really upsetting parents, that it's not good in terms of spatial planning for the city in areas like Rob Royston, which are really at the limit of existing catchment areas, and parents are feeling that their children are put under a lot of pressure to travel large distances in inclement weather to access schooling. Some are not able to access the schools altogether. This is right on the boundary of East Dunbartonshire, so there is an issue with a previous arrangement with Eastern Bartonshire Council, previous to that under Strathclyde Region, where placing requests were much more easy to facilitate. That has been less the case in recent years as this planned capacity of the schools has been reduced. So there's a number of issues pertaining to the north of Glasgow and secondary school capacity in particular, but also the primary estate, where we're seeing modular buildings used at Wallacewell Primary School to sustain capacity, and also with Smithycroft now reaching capacity, their planned solution is to build modular buildings. I really don't think it's acceptable. I've certainly examined the modelling for school capacity planning in Glasgow. Whilst on the face of it, it looks good, the projections just don't seem to tally with lived experience of people in those communities. And I'd be keen for the Cabinet Secretary to engage with Glasgow City Council on this issue, to explore options with perhaps Eastern Bartonshire Council, with the rebuild proposal for Lenzie Academy as well, and whether there could be options to share capacity with new build estates in the north of the city with Eastern Bartonshire. I have written to the Cabinet Secretary on this matter. I'm still awaiting, I believe, a formal response from her. But I would be keen for her to meet with me and representatives of the community to discuss this in more detail, and perhaps understand with the new Director of Education, when they're appointed to Glasgow, how we can plan ahead for this in a more robust and resilient way, because whilst on the face of it the modelling looks good, it's simply not tallying up to lived experience in Rob Royston. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Sweeney. I now call Bill Kidd to be followed by Paul O'Kane. Mr Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to speak in today's debate. And I have to thank Sarah Boyack down at the front there for having introduced it. So we never mind about the fact that Bob Doris wasn't even in the room. Anyway, sorry about that, Pam. I welcome the opportunity to speak in today's debate. As a member of the Education, Children and Young People Committee, it's been a pleasure to work together with colleagues from across the Chamber on a wide variety of issues concerning Scotland's education landscape. And I've genuinely enjoyed my time serving on the committee. The dedication shown by colleagues from every party on the committee reminds me every week that whatever our political colours, we are here for the same purpose: to improve education in Scotland and to give every young person the chance to develop and to thrive. In that vein, Presiding Officer, it's important that we ground this debate in the real challenges facing our schools, and not on slogans or point scoring, but on facts. The Scottish Government's amendment highlights the challenges we have faced post-COVID. This is the reality. Schools have had to struggle with reduced attendance, greater variation in pupil engagement and a significant rise in additional support needs. That is why I welcome additional funding to improve outcomes for children with ASN and to strengthen and expand the ASN workforce. Let's be clear, these steps will directly impact classroom experience, ensuring that children who need the most support receive it and the staff delivering that support are properly equipped. I welcome the recent agreement that ensures Scotland's teachers remain the highest paid in the UK, as was mentioned by the Cabinet Secretary, with a 7.5% uplift over 2 years. And I also welcome the commitment to undertake further work to reduce teacher workload, alongside the commitment to reduce class contact time. And yes, crucially, Presiding Officer, we must celebrate the successes of Scotland's young people, their achievements in classrooms and communities in arts, sciences and sports deserve recognition in this chamber and beyond. Turning to today's motion, yes, there are challenges. Yes, we have work to do. And to tackle these issues, we need to work together rather than attacking. We should be supporting the work that is being done. To say pupils and staff are being failed is disingenuous and disrespectful to all those who work hard to improve our education system. To refer to the Scottish Government as the Scottish National Party administration, I find disrespectful. I would hope for better from colleagues who I have always respected. I frequently disagree with the actions of the UK Government, but I still refer them to, as such, the UK Government. It's basic respect for the institution, and I would have hoped that we might hold ourselves to the same standard here in Scotland. Presiding Officer, pupils and staff deserve a debate that lifts them up, not a motion that uses them as a weapon. They deserve cooperation, not division. Despite the wording of the motion, I remain, as always, ready to work with colleagues from all parties for the benefit of children and young people across Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kidd. I call Paul O'Kane to be followed by Ros McCall. Mr O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I begin by thanking the Presiding Officers and all colleagues for the support shown to me during my recent period of leave. Being a dad is the best job in the world, and I join the ranks across the chamber of those who are perpetually caffeinated, who spend moments in morning meetings removing ready-brek from their clothing, and who often find themselves humming the theme tune to Hey Dougie whilst walking the corridors. So it's perhaps fitting that my first contribution on my return is on the subject of education, because there are few issues that we debate in this chamber as important as the learning experiences and the life chances of our children and young people. And we have heard recounted today in some detail the current experiences in classrooms across Scotland. Violence and disruption on the rise, attendance falling dramatically, and cuts to the additional support needed for our children and young people, with teachers feeling undervalued and burnt out. And the evidence is stark from trades unions, from individual teachers, from school leaders and from young people themselves, who often capture the reality with the mobile phone that is in their hand. So this isn't just the Labour Party or opposition MSPs or the media. This is a reality in our schools and in our communities, and the Cabinet Secretary cannot continue to bury her head in the sand. Back in May, I asked the First Minister about violent attacks in Renfrewshire that were uploaded to social media. I was assured there would be meaningful action rather than just more talking shops. He told me that we have listened and that we're taking a number of measures. And yet we know that the EIS has said of government plans, whilst there are elements of their plans which are helpful, the EIS has been clear that the plan must be backed up by sufficient resources to clearly deliver meaningful change to ensure that schools are safe places to learn and to work. And the NASUWT additionally found that in 2025, a shocking 62% of teachers were not aware that the National Action Plan on Relationships and Behaviour was being taken forward. So it seems to me that the view of the First Minister and of the Cabinet Secretary is that this is all somebody else's issue. And we've heard some of that rehearsed, I thought, in the helpful contribution of Willie Rennie. If it's not councils, then it's teachers themselves, who, according to this government and to their amendment today, should be happy with their lot and stop complaining. Indeed, I think there was an air of, you've never had it so good, from the Cabinet Secretary and the front bench. Presiding Officer, I'm constantly inspired by our teachers. I come from a family that has teachers in its ranks. They inspire and shape our young people, often in extremely difficult circumstances. But they are being let down by a lack of leadership. And it is leadership that can be at the heart of so many of these challenges. When I was in East Renfrewshire Council, I was the education convener, and I had the privilege to appoint head teachers to many of our schools. And in doing so, I learned very quickly that leadership can make all the difference in a school community. But we know that there are now significant challenges in being able to recruit head teachers because people do not want to enter that promoted post because of the challenges therein. There is a clear struggle because leadership comes from the top. And it was interesting to hear the Cabinet Secretary make reference to the Scotland team and to Steve Clarke. I mean, I think it is clear that Steve Clarke leads from the front. I'm not sure the government could compare themselves to the bold vision and the bold energy of Steve Clarke. I thought that was a bold comment at the beginning of this debate. Because I do have to ask, and I'm sure people across Scotland who are watching and engaged in this debate have to ask, what is it going to take for the government to take their fingers out of their ears and listen to teachers who are walking away from professions that they love? What will it take for them to listen to young people and parents who are worried about what goes on in our schools? And I would have to say that if I were to have a restorative conversation with the Cabinet Secretary, I would say to her gently that it is clear that we need a new direction and that is the only way to solve the current crisis in our schools. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kane. I now call Ros McCall to be followed by George Adam. Ms McCall.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I thank Labour for bringing this debate to the Chamber in an afternoon that's been focused on education and schools in Scotland. And I would like to also state from the outset that the issues in our education system in no way reflect the hard work and dedication provided by teachers and support staff all across the country. But why do we find ourselves in the position where Scotland's classrooms are the most violent in the UK, where over a third of our teachers have been attacked with a weapon, when there's been more than 64,000 school bullying incidents reported by 25 local authorities, and where a survey by NASUWT in March found that 83% of members in Scotland said that the number of violent and abusive pupils has increased in the last 12 months? Why are we in the position where we are the worst in the UK? And if we don't look at these issues objectively and without prejudice, then we cannot change the outcomes for teachers and children and young people across Scotland. And I would like to highlight where I think some of the issues could be addressed. The essential need for boundaries for a developing mind. According to child development experts like Dr. Ross Green, the author of The Explosive Child, or Dr. Dan Siegel, the co-author of The Whole Brain Child, children who grow up with clear and consistent rules tend to have better self-control, stronger decision-making skills and healthier relationships. Without boundaries, children can struggle with self-regulation, develop anxiety and find it difficult to respect others' limits. And I believe that this is essential for boundaries and understandable consequences. These are a contributory factor to the reason why Scotland has a greater proportion of violence than the other 3 of the 4 nations of the UK. And this opinion is not mine alone. There is increasing doubts among unions and experts that the Scottish education policy of restorative approach to behavioural management. Mike Corbett of the NASUWT in Scotland stated that the wholesale adoption of the restorative approach to pupil discipline has definitely been a problem. You can't offer a quiet chat with no serious consequences for this level of disruptive behaviour. So whilst a structured conversation between staff and pupils to address incidents of poor behaviour is certainly an option, it has to be backed up with robust consequences that are completely accepted and understood. I will. Thank you.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Rose McCall for taking the intervention. Isn't it right that what we're talking about in restorative practice only actually works once a person has developed the skills of empathy and understanding and the consequences of their own actions?
Rose McCall.
Yes, and I thank Martin Whitfield for the intervention, and I couldn't agree more. There is, at a certain level, but the consequences not only have to be accepted by the pupil, they must also be accepted by the parents, by the teachers, by the local authority alike. And I would urge the Scottish Government to readdress its approach in this way. Another issue that is having a detrimental effect on behaviour in our classrooms is the rise of additional support needs within the classroom setting. There is so much evidence coming forward to the detriment placed on our young people due to things like the extended lockdowns throughout the pandemic and the harmful side effects of smartphone apps. It is essential that we accept the current position and provide ASN staff accordingly. I have previously mentioned in this chamber a number of pupils with the additional support needs has increased significantly. And in 2024, there were 284,448 pupils in Scotland's schools with additional support needs, which represents a record high of 40.5% of the total pupil population. And conversely, the number of ASN teachers decreased to a record low of 2,837. So in 2010, one ASN teacher was supporting 20 pupils, while by 2024 that same teacher was supporting over 100 pupils. Without proper investment in ASN support staff, the difficulties in our classrooms will continue to rise. So in conclusion, we can make the policy changes that will actively change the outcomes for Scotland's children, but only if we have a government that is willing to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McCall. And I call George Adam. Mr Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary opened up with her speech and talking about hope in Scotland's men's football team and the hope that gives us all with the great result they had last night. And while celebrating the Scottish team's men's team last night, I have to remind the Chamber that all roads lead to the United States lead to Paisley, or they go through Paisley, whether you're going to Paisley International Airport, or the fact that Steve Clark, John McGinn, Kenny McLean and Lawrence Shankland all played for the mighty St Mirren and Paisley. So as always, there's always a Paisley connection, but 3 of these players were youth players, and currently St Mirren, along with UWS, which is connected to the debate, have a programme where players that maybe don't make it to the top grade in football get the opportunity to try and do something else and look at another career as well. But the Cabinet Secretary was right to bring up the importance of hope, because we all know the story of Pandora's box, because it wasn't actually a box, it was just a sealed container. But she opened and released all the troubles of the world, and only hope remained inside the box. This, presiding officer, is to tell us that it can be better, we can make it better, and in difficult times we can make things a lot better as well. But listening to the Labour Party, you get the impression that if they ever had what was left of Pandora's box, they've just tossed the jar. Because in reality, I've been to in my constituency on Friday. I was at Flexible Learning Resource Senior Phase in Foxbar and Paisley, where additional support needs school, where they actually were talking. I was only meant to be there for a short time, and I ended up spending about an hour and a half to 2 hours with my office manager, moving backwards and forwards regularly to try and get me out, because it was so interesting listening to these young people who are now in that area to learn, and what they knew about politics was probably more than a lot of the people that are in this room here today. And that shows you. And I also, as always, will talk about my own personal circumstances with my granddaughter Daisy being diagnosed with autism, and now in the last year she's been put into a class along with other neurodivergent young men and boys and girls as well, and she has moved forward as well. So when I say all this, I want to recognise, as all of us must, the very real challenges that teachers and school staff are dealing with every single day, whether it's rising additional support needs, the lingering effects of the pandemic, or the pressures that come from supporting families through a cost of living crisis that's not of Scotland's making. Our teachers are carrying a huge weight. And I want to put in the record my gratitude to every one of them. Their commitment, their compassion and their professionalism are the backbone of Scotland's education system. But, presiding officer, acknowledging challenge is not the same as accepting the bleak and frankly uninspiring picture painted by Labour's motion. Scotland's teachers and Scotland's young people deserve better than a narrative that overlooks progress, ignores success and at times seems more focused on political point scoring than actual solutions. Because the truth, backed by the evidence from across Scotland, is that this government is delivering improvements, investing heavily and working side by side with teachers to build a better education system. Look at the facts. Attainment is rising. Pass rates at National 5 and higher advanced higher are up, not just compared with last year, but compared to pre-pandemic levels. Literacy and numeracy attainment in our primary secondary school are at a record high at the moment as well. Presiding officer, if that is failure, I'd hate to see what success looks with the opposition parties. We're seeing record numbers of young people achieving vocational and technical qualifications, over 110,000, proof that the Scottish Government's commitment to create multiple pathways is working. Presiding officer, our teachers are working hard and our young people are achieving more than ever, and this government is investing more, delivering more and supporting more than any other administration in the United Kingdom. For this debate to be valid and constructive, we must accept the current successes in education and look to see how we can take them to the next level. Only then can we really say we're looking to build a better educational landscape for our young people in Scotland.
Thank you, Mr Adam. We will now move to closing speeches. I call on Lorna Slater to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In my opening speech, I talked about the crushing workload challenges faced by teachers as a result of the expansive and unnecessary bureaucracy built around our curriculum. The other major challenge we hear about more than any other from teachers and school staff is the lack of support for children with additional needs. Much like workload and bureaucracy, this isn't new, but the situation has certainly got much worse recently. The grim reality is that many children with additional support needs must catastrophically fail before the support they need is put in place. Trauma has become a prerequisite of support when it could be avoided entirely. There are a range of reasons for that, but one is that the underpinning legislation is simply out of date and no longer fit for purpose. The 2004 Act sets out rigid criteria for a coordinated support plan, the only kind of plan for children with additional needs which has statutory underpinning. That makes it the only plan which gives a child and their parents or carers the option of going to tribunal for redress if their needs are not met. In hindsight, the criteria for a CSP should never have gone on the face of the bill. They should have been set out in regulations, making it much easier for them to evolve in response to changes in our schools and in society at large. For example, we have massively expanded access to mental health counsellors in schools now. And this is one area of progress in which we should all be proud. But because more counsellors are now located within schools, they do not count as a separate source of support. And the 2004 Act requires support from at least 2 sources for at least 12 months for a child to qualify for a coordinated support plan. That step forward in access to mental health support has perversely led to a step backward in access to CSPs for some young people, though that is far from the whole story. It certainly doesn't explain why only 1 in every 150 children with a recognised additional support need actually have a CSP. Not every child with additional needs actually requires a CSP, but thousands more do, and they're not able to get one. The 2004 Act needs updated, and that must include revising the criteria for a CSP, as well as creating a power for them to be updated by regulation in the future. The Greens were disappointed when the Scottish Government announced that it was dropping the LDAN bill this session. That would have been our opportunity to at least fix this aspect of the 2004 Act. I hope that the next government makes the time for an LDAN bill and a full revision of the 2004 Act, either as part of that bill or through a standalone piece of legislation. Changing legislation alone won't solve the huge challenges faced by young people with additional needs and those trying to support them, but it is an essential part of the process. The other area for improvement is staffing. Children with complex needs are often supported and cared for by staff who have no specific training in this area at all. That is why the Scottish Greens have been working with the Scottish Government on proposals for a qualification and registration system for ASN assistants. There are solutions to the problems that our schools face. This Parliament should be far more focused on those solutions than is often the case in these debates. But I'm glad we've at least had the opportunity to discuss these issues. They could not be more important to the people that we represent, to individuals, families, communities, and to our society as a whole. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Leader. I now call on Liz Smith to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you. When it came to my teacher training course, the only thing that really mattered was how I could get on in front of a class. Forget all the theory, forget the coloured pencils, the size of the lines on all the paper, what you wrote on the blackboard, and that shows how long ago it was. What mattered most was how did you get on with young people, and crucially, could you build trust between you and your pupils? And that trust was partly dependent on the innate chemistry in the room, but also on the environment within which the teaching and learning would take place. And I don't just mean the physical state of the building, although that's important, but also the atmosphere in the classroom. Was it based on a calm self-discipline where the expectations of high standards are well understood and adhered to, where both pupils and teachers recognise that certain structures and routines are beneficial to good quality education? Deputy Presiding Officer, we need a school system that works, a curriculum which inspires, which is complemented by an exam system which not only aspires to the highest possible standards, but which is diverse and responsive to the needs of different pupils. A system that rewards hard work and which stands no nonsense from disruptive pupils and, indeed, on a few occasions, disruptive parents. It doesn't pander to pupils and to parents, that allows head teachers to have their own autonomy and which values extracurricular activity because of what it adds to the educational experience in terms of building resilience, self-esteem and confidence. Yeah. As has been rehearsed this afternoon by several speakers, sadly in too many cases, despite all the good things that are happening in Scottish education, we have seen a breakdown in classroom discipline, for which I believe many factors are at play, because it's true in society as well as it is in schools, but that does not excuse it. Indeed, it makes it even more important that we address the issues. What do I want to see? Firstly, far more autonomy for our head teachers, and I cite just one example of where I think change could be made. In a local authority which tells all its schools that on their 5 in-service days they must all do the same topic, irrespective of whether that topic is relevant to that particular school. That can't be right. We need far more rigour on the 3 Rs, because business and industry are still moaning that in far too many cases young recruits do not have a grasp of the very basic skills. No one should underestimate the frustration that young people encounter if they cannot read, write and count properly. And that leads to poor behaviour and a lack of motivation. As I've said many times before in this chamber, we need reform to the middle years of secondary education so it's much more like a European model which values the parity of esteem and which develops meaningful apprenticeships at a much younger age. And we need to address the problem of the disengaged. Longer-serving members in this Parliament will recall the Newlands Junior College initiative in Glasgow, which produced excellent results when it came to motivating our most disengaged pupils, and how sad it was that that couldn't continue because of a political agenda. Lastly, and I think this is probably a bit controversial, but I'm going to say it, I am strongly of the view that we are far too inclined to make pupils believe that they can't do things rather than they can do things. We tend to make them think that they have a problem when they don't. And that's where extracurricular activity comes in. And yes, residential outdoor education too. You won't be surprised to hear me say that. Because every single young person has it within themselves to be good at something. And we should all be ensuring that they have that opportunity. So I support Pam Duncan-Glancy's motion and Miles Briggs' amendment.
Thank you, Ms Smith. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Jennifer Ruth to close on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, thank you. I do welcome those MSPs and parties who came forward with solutions in today's debate. And of course, we've just been hearing from Liz Smith, a fellow former teacher, about the importance of the 3 Rs. But Ms Smith also talked about the role of local authorities, which we've heard some of today, in dictating perhaps in-service days, and the importance of listening to the profession in that regard too. I thought our final points around about our curriculum and how we might be able to meet the needs of all learners better, particularly out with perhaps a formal curriculum, are really important. One of the aspects that Miles Briggs, Willie Rennie, Martin Whitfield, Ross Greer and I were discussing on Friday at the School Leaders Conference in Loch Lomond was around about school funding post-pandemic. Now, in fairness, Pam Duncan-Glancy, I know she wasn't able to be there, but she did also talk about making PEF permanent, and I just want to again put on the record that that commitment I have made very clear. If my party is re-elected next year, we will continue that funding, but I also know that Scottish Labour are in a similar position on that issue. But there is a big picture question here about school funding that we haven't really interrogated today. And that question that I have for Labour benches, but also for the rest of Parliament is that enough? I don't think it is anymore. I think our schools are now meeting the needs of a variety of different parts of society, whether that be health needs, whether it be income maximisation for parents and carers. And I think we need to look in the totality at the funding that's going to schools. So I heard Mr Rennie's points, a number of which I have to say I don't agree with. But on John Wilson's appointment, this is actually an opportunity to look again at radical approaches to school funding, because I think our schools are now meeting needs that go beyond our educational requirements, and we need to reconfigure budgets to recognise that. And I think that... Happy to do so.
Liz Smith.
I understand what the Cabinet Secretary is saying, but it's not just all about money. It's about a cultural change that is required in our schools. And I pick up the point that my colleague Rose McCall said. It's about ensuring that we have the right culture and that we accept that there are so many things that schools are doing well. We should surely be enhancing that. And it's not just about money. It's about that culture and how we build the trust between pupils and teachers.
Cabinet Secretary.
I very much agree with the points that Ms Smith has made, and I think in reflecting on our own teaching, that importance of building trust with your pupils, with your class, has been fundamental to all I've done in my time in teaching. I know it was for Ms Smith additionally. That, I think, was eroded during the pandemic, and we should be mindful of that challenge. For many young people, returning to formal education has been difficult. We heard from a number of members this afternoon, Presiding Officer, about the important role of our teachers and our support staff. And Willie Rennie and others talked about the importance of teachers in our schools. I think George Adam as well spoke specifically to this point. Mr Rennie was also right to speak about the increase in additional support needs pupils. We heard that, I think, from Ms McCall and again from George Adam. And I do want to say that I was very pleased, of course, that Mr Rennie's party, supported by the Green Party, voted for the Government's budget last year, which provided an extra £29 million for the ASN workforce. Another stream of work that we've committed to undertaking is a wider review of ASN, which is a cross-party review, Presiding Officer. And as part of that, Mr Rennie came forward with a very positive suggestion for a national conference. And again, I give confirmation today that we will be holding a national conference on best practice in relation to additional support needs. I think that was a very sensible suggestion that Mr Rennie came forward with, and I hope he respects and recognises the Government is very much listening to his views in this space. Another point I would like to make in relation to ASN is the National Data Summit that I opened last Wednesday at Murrayfield. Part of the challenge here, particularly in relation to ASN that we see across the country, are various approaches to monitoring and tracking ASN and measurements. That disturbs the national picture that we have because it's not giving us necessarily an accurate data set. So the national conference we had last week was extremely important. I look forward to continuing to work with COSLA on arriving at a national understanding of how we measure ASN better and get that accurate picture. I give way to Mr Johnson.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary, and first of all, I'm very much encouraged by her points around data. I also wonder whether she might reflect on Lorna Slater's point about coordinated support plans, which are used much less frequently than their equivalents in England, because I think certainly for additional support these people, they need a plan, but currently coordinated support plans are only applied if they coordinate delivery from beyond the local, beyond the school, and is that not a flaw?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I hear the point the member makes, and of course this was made by Lorna Slater previously. We have debated this issue in the Education Committee. Coordinated support plans, of course, carry a statutory responsibility that other plans, which also exist, do not. I think there is often a reticence at local authority level to use those plans for reasons around it being statutory, but that's something, of course, we will consider in the wider review. And I think Ms Slater made an interesting point in that regard too. Too often I have at my door parents and carers who are frustrated by the system when it has not worked for their child or young person. We need to resolve those matters. We need to recognise where the powers rest at local authority level, but we also need to provide clearer national direction in that regard too. Presiding Officer, I'm conscious of time, and in closing, I do want to praise the hard work which goes on in our schools every day and the achievements of our young people and their teachers. In short, Presiding Officer, we must give our schools hope, and I do think that some of the contributions we've heard from this afternoon provide us with the necessary impetus to that end. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I call on Martin Whitfield to wind up the debate on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 6 minutes, please.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I do notice to the Register of Interest. And it is a pleasure to close this debate on behalf of Scottish Labour, a debate that speaks to the heart of what education should be. And if I pick up on Liz Smith's memories of teacher training, and no doubt the Cabinet Secretary herself, the number of times where, as teachers, you are told you are the weather in the classroom. And that actually speaks to Liz Smith's intervention about the importance of culture, because that weather in the classroom is about the culture that is developed. And what should that culture be? What should that weather be? Well, a safe, supportive environment where every child can learn, where every teacher can teach without fear. But that is not the reality that many are experiencing in Scotland's schools today. And that is not to talk down our staff. That is certainly not to talk down our young people, or indeed their parents, or indeed the communities that stand around them. It is a reality. There has been surely an unacceptable deterioration in classroom behaviour. There has been factually a shocking rise in violent incidents. The IS report, 80% of their branches experience weekly violence and aggression. Aberdeen alone, incidents surged by over 300% in 2019. Both subjective evidence and objective mathematical evidence of an increase. Teachers are being pushed. They are being hit by objects, and they are being assaulted. Police Scotland, 63 cases of weapons being brought into schools in just 3 months this year. And these aren't isolated events, they're symptoms of a crisis. If we look at the annual household survey published this week, and we're not talking about people who interact with schools on a daily basis, 69% of adults in Scotland were satisfied with their local schools. That is down from 81% in 2011. That is the perception that our communities are having of the schools that sit at the heart of our communities. But I want to talk to some of the contributions that we've had today. I just want to pick up on just one of the many statistics that Miles Briggs talked about. 30% of our pupils missing more than 10% of their teaching. That's an unacceptable figure. It was a figure that we discussed, or a condition that we discussed at the SLS conference on Friday. And again, to pick up on Willie Rennie's comment, again, the Hayward Review. I have forgotten the number of times that Willie Rennie has raised the Hayward Review and why, like so many previous reviews and reports, it just sits on a shelf gathering dust. I want to pick up on Paul Sweeney's contribution, who picked a very particular regional problem. but I think speaks to a breakdown in the understanding between local authorities, Scottish Government and families who have lived experiences. And that is the spatial planning problem. Happy to give way if it's quick.
Unfortunately, the Cabinet Secretary ran out of time before referring to my speech, but would he perhaps invite her to respond to my letter of the 4th of September? Thank you.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm grateful for that intervention, and I think you have an answer if it hasn't quite made the record. I do want to pick up on Paul O'Kane, and firstly to welcome my colleague back into the chamber. He has been missed, and it was almost a disappointment that he had to refer to a question from his previous time in this chamber, asking about the fact that violence is being filmed in schools by young people and loaded up onto the internet, where it will live forever, and the dissatisfaction that there still has not been a realistic solution to that problem. I want to turn, because time is short, to the Cabinet Secretary's amendment, and indeed a contribution from both the Cabinet Secretary and from Lorna Gray and also from Bill Kidd with regard to the amendment. And I would make reference, begrudgingly, I suppose, to the standing orders and the guidance that sits in this Parliament about the purpose of motions. The purpose of motions is not to provide solutions. It is the core procedural tool to manage parliamentary business and then allow us to have a democratic debate, which is what's happened this afternoon. So if I look at the Government's proposed amendment, and it paints a picture, the Cabinet Secretary says, of progress, of glory, of almost the perfect environment. And they cite the pay deals, the vague commitments to workload reduction. But let's be honest, none of this addresses what the core issue is. Teachers do not feel safe. Pupils do not feel safe. Families are losing confidence in our schools. The amendment ignores the reality that the scaffolding of support around young people has collapsed. Additional support needs provision is stretched to breaking point, CAMS waiting lists unmanageable, support staff numbers falling dramatically. These failures feed the vicious cycle, the unmet needs that leads to the dysregulated behaviour that we've heard about, driving teachers out of the profession, leaving classrooms even more unsupported. I would suggest the Scottish Government's amendment is actually complacent. It celebrates a pay deal, which of course is welcome, but ignores the fact that even as a consequence of that, 80% of teachers are considering leaving the profession because of violence, because of aggression. And that is a reality that we need to confront. Presiding Officer, I am conscious that time is short on this. And so in restoring confidence in an education system that should be the pride of Scotland, not a source of fear and frustration. So let us send a clear message today that this Parliament does not accept unsafe schools, will not accept broken support systems, will not accept excuses. We will act to make our schools safe. We will act to support them, and we will act to make them fit for the future. I'm grateful, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Whitfield. Point of order, Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the course of the debate, I was not able to have time to respond to Paul Sweeney's point. I checked with my private office and a response was sent to him on his ask for a meeting last Wednesday. I've asked for it to be resent to him, and I'm more than happy to meet with him and engage on the issues he's raised today.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Not a point of order, but on the record.